Hi, and welcome back again to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So, last time I mentioned the life transforming potential of this simple idea of love and desire put forth in Plato's Symposium by the prophetess Diotima. There is fundamentally only one human desire, she said, and that is desire for the good. I say life transforming because it seems to give us the power to resolve the inner conflict that at times drives human beings to despair, and to see ourselves in a radically new way, as beings who are, as I explained last time, both fundamentally free and fundamentally good. But we also saw how this idea raises a lot of questions, and I want to start to answer those today. And in doing that, I'll be explaining, by the end of this episode, why I think there's something psychedelic, actually, about Plato's idea of this ultimate object of human desire, the good. Diotima's teaching on love and desire is, as I said, simple, and yet it's also, for most of us, I think, neither easy to get our heads around exactly or easy to believe. We may also have felt puzzled or skeptical because it may have seemed to us that Diotima made a rather large logical leap. She seemed to reach this view of love and desire in a single step from this idea she put forth that eros is desire for good things. So, apart from her now inexplicably widening out the scope of eros so that it's now not just one particular kind of desire, but desire as such, how does she get from saying it's for good things, which kind of seems obvious, to saying it's for the good? And what does she mean by that exactly? It's puzzling because by saying eros is for good things, she seems or could seem to be saying it's for good things in the sense of attractive or pleasant things. But when she talks about it being for the good, it seems to at least hold out the possibility that she means the good in the sense we usually mean of goodness, the good in an ethical sense. So we've arrived at something huge in Plato. One of the great contributions of Plato to philosophy, I think probably his greatest one, actually, is a deeply subversive understanding of the good. It's also deeply difficult. That said, I don't think we should be discouraged by the obscurity of Plato's idea of the good, because the contemplation of it, I think, is so fundamentally rewarding, so fundamentally consciousness expanding, that even to stand in perplexity before it is already to be, in a way, enlightened by it. Our big source for Plato's thinking on the good is one passage of the Republic. You may be familiar with it. It comes toward the end of Book 6, not long before his discussion of the cave at the beginning of Book 7. One of the things that makes this passage so well known is that it advances this view of the good as not a mere human construct, an ethical principle, but as difficult for us to grasp as it may seem, an idea that is the principle of both objective and subjective reality. Socrates is talking about the education of those who will serve as guardians of his imaginary city, when he seems to casually mention the greatest study of all. This, he says, is the study of the idea of the good. And he famously talks about how we both do not know the good, but also need to know it. He says, we have no adequate knowledge of it. And if we do not know it, then even without the knowledge of this, even if without the knowledge of this, we should know all other things never so well, you are aware that it would avail us nothing. Just as no possession either is of any avail without the possession of the good. He talks a bit later in a similar vein, and also one which reminds us of Diotima's teaching, that Eros is the child of poverty and resource. All our desire, Socrates says, is for the good, which everyone craves and strives to grasp, and does to some extent, but never fully. It's something we all both know and do not know. He calls it that which every psyche pursues and for its sake does all that it does, with an intuition of its reality, but yet baffled and unable to apprehend its nature adequately, or to attain to any stable belief about it as about other things, and for that reason failing of any possible benefit from other things. So he uses this phrase, which the American classical scholar Paul Shorey, and that's a translation I'm using, translates as with an intuition of its reality. So the original Greek actually has a religious connotation that Shorey's translation is missing. Apomentoiomene, TNI is the Greek. Apomentoiomeno is a verb that comes from mantoiomai, to divine or prophesy, and we see it in this root mantis, or prophet, that we also saw associated with Diotima, of course. It appears in the name of her hometown. So it really means, you could say, with an intuition of its reality, but a more literal translation is divining it to be something. Now we start to get into why it is that the good is so difficult for us to grasp. Asked by Glaucon to explain the nature of the good, Socrates again alludes to the difficulty of knowing it. He says, I fear that my powers may fail, and that in my eagerness I may cut a sorry figure and become a laughingstock. He is willing, though, to talk about what he calls an offspring of the good, an analogy for it. And this is also a famous passage from Plato. He talks about how vision and the visible need a third thing for there to be seeing, light, and how the sun is the cause of light. And then he says, as the good is in the intelligible region to reason and the objects of reason, the Greek is nous and the noumena. You could also say mind and the objects of mind, or thought and the objects of thought. As the good is in the intelligible region to these things, so is this, the sun, in the visible world to vision and the objects of vision. So somehow the good is necessary for the mind and the things it seeks to know, to be able to be actualized in thought. The good is necessary for both to happen, as though it actualizes the potential of both. He explains this in the somewhat cryptic way that marks this passage a bit later. This reality, then, that gives their truth to the objects of knowledge and the power of knowing to the knower, you must say, is the idea of good, and you must conceive it as being the cause of knowledge and of truth insofar as known. Yet, fair as they both are, knowledge and truth, in supposing it to be something fairer still than these, you will think rightly of it. But as for knowledge and truth, even as in our illustration, it is right to deem light and vision sun-like, but never to think that they are the sun. So here it is right to consider these two, their counterparts, as being like the good, or boniform, good-like, but to think that either of them is the good is not right. Still higher honor belongs to the possession and habit of the good than knowledge or truth. Again, I think this is quite difficult, and also I think kind of reminiscent of Hegel, but it's as though for Plato things do not come into existence without being thought. And so the good, by being the principle of knowledge, is also for Plato the principle of being. And thus, as impossible as it sounds, the good is somehow above or beyond being. Socrates tells Glaucon, the objects of knowledge not only receive from the presence of the good their being known, but their very existence and essence is derived to them from it. Though the good itself is not essence, but still transcends essence. Shori translated this Greek word ousia as essence. It's also sometimes translated as being, and especially in the case of Aristotle, as substance. The good itself is not essence, but still transcends essence or being in dignity and surpassing power. As if this isn't difficult enough to get our heads around, having said this, Socrates comes back in Book 7 after relating his analogy of the cave to suggest that the good is not above being, but in some way the highest form of it. The mind, he says, must be turned around from the world of becoming together with the entire psyche, until the psyche is able to endure the contemplation of essence and the brightest region of being. And this, we say, is the good. So, we have here something that is both known and isn't, and is both a being and beyond being. Barrels of ink, in the words of one scholar, have been filled trying to explain Plato here. What we often find in these attempts are the minutest dissection of his wording, everything that's involved in grammar, vocabulary or lexis, they call it, syntax, morphology, in attempts to extrapolate his thinking into sets of different possible, often highly articulated interpretations. At the risk of going out on a limb, I'll say I'm not really sure if this is the most helpful way of reading Plato or how he intended his books to be read. It seems to me that at the heart of what he's saying is that the good transcends the everyday world that we live in, where there's subject and object, myself and the other. It's the principle, he says, of both thought and its objects, and it itself transcends them. I think this is really quite an amazing thought. We're used to thinking of the objective and subjective worlds, the universe and one's own experience of it, as all there is. But is it possible there's a higher reality, higher in that it is somehow the cause or principle of both worlds, of the objective and the subjective, the inner and the outer? Perhaps in some way embraces both. Similarly, we're also used to thinking of knowledge or truth as abstract, or if you like, mediated, and feeling as immediate. When we think, we as subjects stand back, as it were, from the object of our thought. We have thoughts about our objects. We don't drink them in some direct or immediate way. We try to find abstractions that fit them. But is it possible that there could be an immediate knowledge? The good, Plato seems to be saying, is somehow, as we said, the source of both subject and object, and as such can't really be an object itself, not even an object of thought. And thus we have a knowledge of it that is not like our knowledge as we normally understand it, our everyday knowledge of objects, the objects that we stand apart from, whether they're physical or mental. And in fact, Socrates actually uses language that suggests immediacy in our knowledge of the good. He talks, for example, about touching the good, seeing it, or being with it. I think another way of saying all this, frankly, is that Plato's good is psychedelic. The term psychedelic was cobbled together from the Greek psyche, or soul, and deiloo, or the verb to reveal in the 50s by British-Canadian psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond. Originally, it was, of course, applied to drugs believed to manifest otherwise unknown mental powers, and eventually took on the sense of consciousness expanding. But of course, we don't need drugs to experience altered states of consciousness, or at least externally supplied drugs. The brain makes its own drugs, endorphins and the hallucinogen DMT, for example, and it brings about its own altered states. Dreaming is just one example of many. I think you could argue that the best art is psychedelic, or that the experience of taking in art is always to some degree psychedelic, that it brings us to states of consciousness in which there's a kind of immediacy of knowing. And maybe you could even say, to steal Socrates' phrase, the psyche is divining that the good is something. And I think this is essentially what Plato is saying in different words about our knowledge of the good also, that it's an immediacy of knowing. We divine the good, we know it in a way that transcends the everyday division between subject and object. And this, I think, is really where it gets its transformative power. And I'll be talking a bit more about that in later episodes. So I hope today we've made at least some progress in trying to figure out what Diotima means when she uses this term, the good, which is such a highly loaded one in Plato, and I don't think was used before or since in that way by anyone else other than Platonists. But I think you'll agree that once again we find ourselves with more questions. I think you might be wondering, in particular, where is Plato getting this idea of the good as the principle of everything? Where does this idea come from? What's the rationale for it? Again, it's not an easy one to answer, but I think it's an extremely rewarding one to answer, or to attempt to answer. We'll be starting that in our next episode. Until then, be well, and thanks for watching.